Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William McKinley, and the focus is a quick start to the presidency. The year is 1896. McKinley is president-elect, and one of the first things he does is he writes a letter to his close friend Mark Hanna, who had been so helpful to him in the campaign, and he makes the point, was there ever such unselfish devotion before? Your unfaltering and increasing friendship through more than 20 years has been to me an encouragement and a source of strength, which I am sure you have never realized, but which I have constantly felt, and for which I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, it was interesting throughout the recent campaign, a lot of politicians, the press, they were the ones saying, well, maybe it was Hanna who was actually in charge, the man behind the curtain pulling all the strings. And cartoonists like Davenport in the New York Journal would put out these cartoons sort of portraying this effect. And look, Hanna was very important to this campaign. It was a different kind of campaign, unlike any in American history, but these charges are really unfair. They were perfect complements to each other, and Hanna was important, but in the end, McKinley was the one with the final say. He was the one who refused to cater to the demands of the political bosses in the East. He was the one who had to press the flesh with the Southern delegates to get them to come on board long before the convention. It might have been Hanna's idea, but it was McKinley that had to deliver. McKinley was the one who had been all those years climbing the Republican Party with his consistent support for protection and the high tariff. It was McKinley that had been aligned to sound money and gave approval of the final words that went into the Republican platform that made that commitment at the recent convention. And it was McKinley who said, nope, I'm not going to challenge William Jennings Bryan on the stump. I'm going to go with the front porch campaign. That also proved to be very effective. McKinley wasn't going to win without Hanna. He needed him. This business-like, money-funded, targeted, sophisticated campaign, certainly Hanna had a lot to do with it, but McKinley was hardly the innocent bystander that some of them portrayed. Elihu Root, who would be his future Secretary of War, put it this way: Hanna was a strong and vigorous man, but McKinley was the controlling spirit of the two. McKinley was the one with the final say. He was now president-elect. With all that in mind, he wanted Hanna to be in his cabinet with him, but Hanna actually continued to say no. Despite some push, Hanna had another job in mind. He wanted to be a U.S. Senator. McKinley eventually agreed to try to help make that happen. And part of this was a sort of a three-way deal where he was going to help by creating an opening in the Senate by offering the Secretary of State position to John Sherman, also from Ohio. McKinley had been a longtime supporter of Sherman, had known him for years. Sherman had been public service for 40 years. He'd been Treasury Secretary before, a longtime senator, kind of getting on the older side. Originally wasn't sure he wanted to make the jump, give up his secure Senate seat, but McKinley sort of put enough pressure on that Sherman agreed. This created the opening, and then they all had to look to the governor of Ohio, Asa Bushnell, to complete the task, to put Hanna into the Senate. This was a little more dicey than they originally thought, because Bushnell was aligned in Ohio politics to Joseph Foraker, also a senator now, former governor. Foraker and Hanna didn't get along. This took a couple of months of some pushing from both Sherman and McKinley, but Bushnell finally came on board, and these dominoes all fell. Sherman became Secretary of State. Hanna became senator from Ohio. McKinley also asked his close friend William Day from Canton, Ohio, to come along and be the Assistant Secretary of State to help out with Sherman. Some of the other decisions in terms of the cabinet, one of the main things, no political bosses. He sought geographic balance. Some of the key names, Lyman, Gage, went to the Treasury Department. Russell Alger became the Secretary of War, went to Massachusetts for John Long as the Secretary of the Navy. Interesting note about James Wilson, Secretary of Agriculture. He began a run 16 years across 4 presidents as the Secretary of Agriculture. Very rare in the history of the cabinet. Of course, McKinley had thousands of appointments to make beyond the cabinet, less so because of the Pendleton Act passed the decade before. McKinley was supportive of his civil service reform, so wasn't going to make wholesale changes, but still lots of decisions to make. And one of his most difficult ones, there was a real push for a reformer from New York, still a young man, had served on the Civil Service Commission for President Harrison. Theodore Roosevelt was getting a lot of push, and McKinley was worried. He told his friend Maria Stover, I want peace. And I'm told that your friend Theodore, well, he's always getting into rows with everybody. Eventually he conceded, brought Roosevelt into the administration as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. McKinley on March 4th, 1897, traveled to the Capitol with Grover Cleveland, the outgoing president. It was a beautiful day. Mother McKinley was there. Of course, Ida McKinley, 40,000 others. McKinley gave a pretty substantive inaugural address. address, beginning with his core topic of protection. According to the president, the people have declared that such legislation should be had as will give ample protection and encouragement to the industries and the development of our country. He also had his stance on currency. And again, he was sort of trying to stand on both sides of this. He'd support bimetallism, but only under certain conditions. According to McKinley, it will be my constant endeavor to secure it, bimetallism, by cooperation with the other great commercial powers of the world. Until that condition is realized, when the parity between our gold and silver money springs from and is supported by the relative value of the two metals, the value of silver already coined and of that which may hereafter be coined must be kept constantly at par with gold by every resource at our command. If he could get parity, he'd be for it. If not, he would reject bimetallism. And this was actually good news for Grover Cleveland, the outgoing president, who was not aligned with McKinley at all on the tariff, but very much aligned on this topic of hard currency, making sure that they would pay their debts in full. McKinley realized that the economy still had some open business. He was calling for a special session of Congress, was going to start 10 days after the inauguration. Some of the other things he talked about in the inaugural address: support for antitrust legislation, continue to support civil service reform and the Pendleton Act, fighting pervasive illiteracy was one of his topics, continuing the modernization of the Navy, and he talked about foreign affairs, which is a completely new area for William McKinley, and he used actually some rather boilerplate language, but turned out to be pretty important for his administration. Here's what he said: "We have cherished the policy of non-interference with affairs of foreign governments wisely inaugurated by Washington, keeping ourselves free from entanglement, either as allies or foes, content to leave undisturbed with them the settlement of our own domestic concerns. We want of their own domestic concerns. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression." Keep that in mind as the McKinley administration rolls on. Ida McKinley, well, she was determined to take on the role of First Lady as much as she possibly could. She is health permitting, of course, because she was continuing to still be unhealthy much of the time, but she was really going to try to take on those social responsibilities as much as she was able to physically. The two would breakfast together almost every day. They would often have lunch together, spend the evenings often alone or in small gatherings. The president would check on his wife multiple times a day. If she needed something, he would simply stop what he was doing. Affairs of state didn't matter. He would go see to her concerns, take care of them, come back as if nothing had happened. Her seizures from epilepsy would continue periodically, and no matter to this, they kind of had a routine down. Take one example where she had a seizure once at a meal with a bunch of people around. The president simply walked up, he took a napkin, put it over her face. The seizure would continue, it would end, he would take the napkin away, sit back down as if nothing ever happened, never big deal about it. It was really nothing that he would not do for his wife amongst everything else on his plate. McKinley had rather fastidious in his attire, usually quite formal. He would change his white shirt 3 or 4 times a day, often had a carnation in his lapel. He loved to give that as a gift to children. And cigars, they were constant, even more than Ulysses Grant, according to some, up to 10 cigars a day, often sharing them with his close friends, Senator Hanna, Charles Dawes, who he appointed as the comptroller of the currency, and Vice President Garret Hobart, also part of his sort of inner social circle. Hobart's wife, Jennie, actually became quite close to Ida McKinley. Now, this is over 100 years since Washington had become the first president of the United States, and still at this stage, the staff for the president, 6 clerks. That's it. His personal secretary was George Cortelyou, and he became his trusted companion, almost always by his side, very important to keeping him going throughout the day. Well, McKinley did call for that special session of Congress. The focus was on the economy, and he partnered with the new chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, Nelson Dingley, to come up with a new tariff. They did this in 4 days, and these tariff rates actually exceeded the rates of the McKinley tariff from a few years before. It passed the House, it passed the Senate. He was happy to sign it into law. It also had the opportunity for those reciprocity agreements we talked about in a previous episode. So this was music to McKinley's ears. He's off on the right foot. True to his word on the currency, McKinley established a commission to go to Europe, test the waters. Could they get this parity, this balance, fixed ratio between silver and gold? And the commission started out in Paris. The French were kind of open to the idea, but they took a wait-and-see mode. Off to Britain, and this was dead. The British simply were not interested in going down this path, and bimetallism at that point was dead. If the powers of Europe were not going to sign on, McKinley wasn't going to either. And so it was back to the gold standard, strict focus on that. And in fact, this got a lot easier when there was a big influx of gold coming from the territory of Alaska, made that even more sound. Well, just like that, the two major economic challenges for McKinley were done. The tariff and the currency, this was basically resolved. One of the other things he had to deal with, though, was in foreign policy right at the outset of his administration. And this had to do with something several thousand miles away in the islands of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Grover Cleveland had nixed the idea of annexation of Hawaii just a couple of months into his administration, but was now almost back on the table because the Japanese were really spending a lot of time sending a lot more immigrants into the Hawaiian Islands. They were sort of saber-rattling a little bit, looking at some imperialism perhaps within the Pacific, and they were pressing for the right to vote for their folks who had now settled in Hawaii. And this was getting contentious. This is only June of 1897, just a couple of months into the McKinley administration. But the Hawaiians who didn't want this really had no military way of pushing back against the Japanese. So this sent them straight to the Americans. And they requested an opportunity to actually be annexed again. And this time it went pretty quickly. In less than 10 days, a treaty was agreed to. McKinley signed on. It went off to the Senate. Now it sat there for a while. But the first question was, what were the Japanese going to do in response? Would they simply take this? Would they be aggressive? Well, it turns out they were not willing to take on the United States on this matter. They agreed to arbitration with the Hawaiians on a few issues, but they were not going to push the U.S. while they were considering this treaty for annexation in the Senate. Well, that would take a little bit of time because there were some people in the Senate who were weary of American imperialism, going so far afield to take on another part of the world into the American orbit. McKinley said that's nonsense. He told reformer Carl Schurz that, you may be sure that there will be no jingo nonsense under my administration. You need not borrow any trouble on that account. Well, perhaps William McKinley spoke too fast on that one. But that's the story for another day. That is William McKinley and a quick start to the presidency from the life of William McKinley. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.